the truth is within. The truth is within us. And I think that's the bit that scares us, because the power that we then hold is immense. If we look outward and if we look at that, our nervous system will not be able to cope. If we just look outwardly, no tree grows from the canopy down. It is a reciprocity. It's like you need the stuff outwardly, you need the support, you need the systems to change, you need the people that are doing other types of work to go back into this compost that's keeping us going. Because, I used to know people that were millionaires, literally some of the most senior people you'd ever meet, and they would be, I'm stuck. And you think, well, practically that is unlikely to be true. Again, might be true. But because you've backed yourself into a corner because of the stories that you've been told and the systems you've built up, you have a choice.
So that's Nick Whitnell talking about roots, nervous systems, and remembering what's good for us and what's true for us by reflecting on nature. If you caught my recent live on leylines and earth energy in our homes and sacred sites, then you'll recognise some of what we talk about today, some of the pattern of today's recording. We're talking about a living, intelligent, almost conscious nature that's always in conversation with us. So today we're staying very mainstream, very grounded, very practical. And here is Nick Whitnell to talk about the way that he interacts with nature and what he has learned from it. So Nick, thank you for coming along today. It's fantastic to actually speak to you on air, as it were. I know we've connected once or twice before. But what I loved about your work, what I loved about first seeing you on LinkedIn and the blogs that you write there, is your passionate connection to nature and to the kind of task, which is similar to the work I do in a way, but maybe less subtle energy based. But you're really trying to bring intuition and our connection to nature through to the fore. So tell us a little bit about how you work with individuals and collective, perhaps, about doing that process.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. So for me, what I find so interesting has been my own journey gives me the link that I found back into intuition. So that's been the kind of remembering that I would say that I've been through, of having those seeds within me that I've then had to, I suppose, almost nurture and become aware of again. So my work has very much been based upon the kind of real experience of how we are finding ourselves in this world of, the unraveling and the emerging of different things that are occurring. And I think what I do is I just create this opportunity for people to use land and nature often as the metaphor for starting to look at how does nature provide the wisdom that we all know and can feel, because obviously that is who we are intuitively. But what it basically is starting to give that time to slow down enough to start to feel that when we notice, when we witness the things that have happened to us in our lives, we can often pick up these threads that have always occurred and always been there. So what I do is I've created, it is named inner roots, outer fruits. So this idea of we start with the roots, we start with that sort of depth of almost soul really and psyche and things like that, to start to really explore what does it feel to be connected in that way. And then we begin to bring that out into the world. We begin to grow in a way that creates this kind of ecosystem that is very much looking at a canopy in a different way as the kind of leaves and the different structures. But sometimes we can get ourselves kind of caught up in this idea that we have to have the polished outer bit built already. Whereas what I'm saying is we turn that on its head and we start to say, let's start with that lower, deeper knowing, the kind of the roots, the nourishing, and in some ways the shadows. We start to look at those bits we might have explored, might have ignored for a long time, and we begin to start to really base ourselves in that. And that's kind of a lot of my teachings, a lot of my learning, a lot of my sort of work that I do begins at that point. And it's very much linked to you could also look at the world I used to be in around more kind of, marketing and businessy type stuff. It's you start with what's true first and then you build outwards. Whereas I think sometimes in ourselves, we can start with what people see. And that's the bit we can get ourselves into a bit of a pickle, because we start polishing that was actually there's no roots. There's nothing there to sustain you when the times are tough or when things get more complicated.
That's wonderfully said. That's really interesting, isn't it? Because we so often are actually functioning from how we think people perceive us. And that's exactly what you're saying. There's no roots there to work up.
A lot of my work is very much people that are standing at these kind of thresholds. They may or may not name it in that way. They may or may not feel in that way. But there's this kind of slight sense of I've kind of lived the story that I've been given in certain ways. We are often living through these stories. They might have found themselves either in a position within their life, their career, their choices, and they're kind of just stuck in this place where they think, well, I don't quite know where to step next. So they're kind of at this point, and it's an interesting one recently because exploring this idea around, we can use the words like midlife crises. We can use these words like I'm making too many changes or things. And there's often we get caught in these dualities or these binary things of I have to make these massively huge jumps in different directions. Whereas what I often help people with is just to say, here's a threshold of something. You've noticed it yourself. You're obviously reaching out for a conversation with somebody like me or, other people. And it's then that thing of saying, well, I've tried the other ways. I might have tried all the other paths that are already available to me, and they just haven't worked. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more within society is that we've kind of had this obedience in some ways between these belief systems that are formed. And then we start to realize, well, that doesn't feel right because I feel like I should be, this idea of I should be happier, I should be more successful, I should be all these things. But actually, what it's really doing is telling us that our intuitive state, our deeper soul, is having this sense of it's not feeling okay. So that's all it really, that's always the kind of the seed that always comes through in my work is whatever the practical manifestation is of someone coming to seek support or conversation, it's generally the way that I work and the way that I've trained is to look much deeper, to start to look at what are the patterns, what are the behaviors, what are the stories that we've told ourselves that may have, I'm very much in the sense of compassion is one of my leading sort of principles of there's no bad parts. We're often taught that we need to shame parts of ourselves, but actually if we give them the light to see what they're telling us, what they might be trying to say, that's where the learning can come from, that's where the growth can come from, and that's ultimately where the wisdom can come from, and the nervous system is a huge part of that as well.
Sir, I must compliment you on your ability to communicate. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, you alluded there to your past. You started out in marketing, and you got a long way in marketing, working in London and all of that busy, busy environment, the corporate environment. Tell us a little bit about that background.
Yeah, sure. I think if we can, I'll probably go slightly further back to give you the context of kind of how I ended up there as well, because I think that's probably important to the story. Is that I was born into a very spiritual household. I had deep connections to the things that I do now, so I was very much aware of the deeper sense of things. Growing up, I was given the knowledge, experience, the exposure to things that are very much, in the realms of what we would consider, the kind of spiritual kind of work and things like that. So to me, that was my upbringing. So that was the kind of conditioning and kind of really useful seeds that I had. Unfortunately, through the loss of my mum at the age of 17, I then had to kind of understand what grown-ups did. The views of a 17-year-old, you think, well, what do I do? I need to find security, I need to find safety. My passion up to that point had been sociology, so I was looking very much at, even like, through history and almost anthropology as well, starting to see why do we do the things that we do. But I suppose the safer path of that, when you don't know quite how to interpret that into a career, back to this idea of, what are the stories that are there? It was, well, do your A levels, do that, get a degree, find some security, which at that time meant money. And that was kind of, the view that I had as a younger sort of person. And I just followed into marketing, because marketing is a kind of outcome in many ways of sociology. It's kind of looking at the way that we formulate things, the way that we're part of cultures, subcultures. And I just basically followed the path. I'd never intentionally wanted to become a corporate person. I never intentionally I had no aspiration or ambition to climb that ladder, but just life happens, and I was very lucky in the sense of I got married young. I had young children at that time. And it was sort of just through the, I suppose, late 90s into the early 2000s, that kind of growth period, and then went into the 2008 financial crash. It happened that I was in an industry that was doing okay. I never did anything that I would consider to be, deep marketing in this. I was marketing sort of services rather than product. But I just got this sense of this isn't me. And that was the bit that ultimately led to my burnout. So I'd lived that story, I'd grown through that path. But fundamentally, I started to see that I needed to build myself another way of being. And that led me back to the seeds, I think, that my mum gave me at a much younger age. And I managed to build the safety to really question things.
Losing your mum at 17, did you ever feel, having had that spiritual kind of awareness at the time, did you ever actually feel at that point the anger of why the F has this happened to me?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, it's a whole journey of healing that I've been on. I think I ignored it for a long time. I lived, and I think also the corporate world that I worked in was a good place to hide potentially from some of those feelings. So I just became kind of busy in that kind of sense of masking, of not having to feel. So I was very much in my mind rather than in my body. So it kind of, the whole sense of the embodiment wasn't there. So I was very cognitive in the sense of I could learn things, I could read things, I could, my mind was growing. I was very good at expanding into different questions and things. But there was definitely an undercurrent of grief and anger that I didn't know how to access. So I didn't for a very long time. It's taken me a long time to get to that point. I think there's also the part of it was for a period of time, also the teachings and the learnings that my mum gave me. I think there's a sense of I now would love to, and obviously depending whatever happens, in future pathways we all have, is I'd love to have that conversation of just saying what I've learned versus what she'd shared with me. And there's a real curiosity there because I found books and writings that she did and authors and philosophers that she was very interested in. And she was part of like really interesting progressive movements in the 60s and 70s. So there's that part of it for me is I got a real sense of healing, I think, as I've grown, that there's an anger, but there's also an acceptance. And I think that's probably been a big part of what I'm about now, is just starting to kind of get that, but also accepting that sometimes these things can happen. And I think that's been part of my own journey as well, of just having to lean into that and accept and get the support that I needed to start to access those painful feelings.
It's a very interesting concept, especially for men, I think. This idea that actually the route, the escape from pain is to take the awareness out of the body, to not be aware of the feeling in the body. I think it's a very, very common experience. Now, your life changed really, didn't it? I think I read a blog of yours where you were sitting on a train traveling up to London at 5 a.m., simply going through the process. But was that the real crunch point when you decided, right, it's got to stop?
I think it was probably a collection of those things. It was a kind of a real building up of those emotions. I think there was that thing again of my cognitive mind was saying, you've built up all these, trinkets of success in inverted commas. You've got the job, you've got the things that people aspire towards, you've got the money, you've got the security. So I was pushing myself to a point that I thought I could continue with. All the while, my body was basically saying at some point, and multiple points, it was screaming at me to say, you are not okay. This is not something you can continue with. So there's examples where I would, work during the week, I would mask up and probably look generally okay. And then I would then come home and I would then absolutely crash out on the sofa, like just physically not able. I went into the full flop kind of sort of territory. And there was times, yeah, I'd get on the train in the morning, I would wake up, you'd go through these things, through the motions of things and think, I don't even remember, we all do this, don't we? Go through this sort of idea of, I just arrived somewhere and I was like, well, how did I get here? Why am I here? And my body again is thinking, well, I think I still want to be in bed. So what on earth is happening? And yet we're again conditioned into this thinking of it has to be this way. There's no other option. We have to continually follow this path because there's no way out. And despite the fact that I had a million choices at that time, I had good, I had a good income. I had, had a little bit of savings. I've never really been someone that I suppose has the most practical sort of other ways of understanding different bits of money. But it's like, for me, it's that thing of I could have chosen many things, but I felt powerless. And I think that's the bit that now I try to help other people, is to see you have choices. I used to know people that were millionaires, literally some of the most senior people you'd ever meet, and they would be, I'm stuck. And you think, well, practically that is unlikely to be true. Again, might be true. But because you've backed yourself into a corner because of the stories that you've been told and the systems you've built up, you have a choice. You have a choice that may not be palatable. You have a choice that may be really painful. But it's, at any point, you could stop, pause, zoom out, and shift your whole perspective and rebuild from that place. But again, that's the terrifying bit. That's the deep, deep soul work of saying, who am I? What am I? What do my belongings say about me? What does my family want from me? What do my friends expect from me? And then when you start to do that, that's the scary bit, because then you think, well, maybe people just like me because I've got a nice car. Maybe people, and they're not true. That's not the case at all. But again, we tell ourselves these stories because that's the way that the system has been sort of created to build this idea of success that is not true.
I think somewhere you wrote that many of the people you work with already know deep down that something needs to change, and they're just scared of admitting it. So how do you actually help them see that inner voice, that feeling, that inner voice is actually a friend rather than a saboteur?
It's a really good point, because I think for a long time we lose track of intuition as a theme, and we can have those parts of ourselves which are adapted parts. So we can sometimes, a lot of the work that I do is around internal family systems, and different part work is getting back in touch with our gut, with the truth, with our intuitive senses is so important, because I agree entirely. You can sometimes sense that, oh, I just need to go off, I need to make these big changes. But actually that could be a younger part that's just saying, I'm triggered, I need to get out of here. That idea of I've got a manager of my own inner sort of being here that's like, nope, get out. Or, these firefighters in the IFS sort of language of how do we get out of this? The big bit that I would say, and it's something that's so beautifully put by Mary Oliver, who I think is an amazing writer and poet, and she says that, at some point that we are able to quieten the other voices to start hearing our own. And I think that's where the work comes in. That's where the beauty comes in. And again, this goes back into, I've been, I've learned and trained in shamanic principles and animist principles and things. And you start to look at this as the blueprint that we hold. And it's this idea again of we arrive in, in my opinion, we arrive into this world kind of, self-actualized and the beautiful divine being that we are. Whereas we, in our culture, would turn on its head and say, Maslow would say, you've got to prove your worth. You've got to build up this ladder of all these practical things. I don't buy into that at all. And that's not the basis of what I found in my research, is that in most other cultures, indigenous cultures, we arrive perfect. We arrive amazing. So therefore, what happens is the system that has been created that is extractive and is the fall of us not having those skills and awareness. That's only been quite recent in terms of modern history. We need to just remember that that is not the truth. That is not the human nature that we were created to have. And therefore, if we can just tap into something that's deeper than that, we can begin to find something that's incredibly powerful, because that's the bit that holds the truth for us. That's the bit that I believe we had in much more abundance, even quite recently. But because of the noise, because of the technology, because of the acceleration of, the capitalistic system that, has gone into this hyper bizarre capitalism, we've been told a lie. And we believe the lie. And that's the bit that all I'm really saying is I don't have the answer. I'll never have the answer. But what I have is I suppose, the curiosity and the compassion to say to myself and others, where do we want to find these things? And we can look outside of ourselves. We can read the books. We can find the gurus. We can, explore that. But fundamentally, most things I've found around any kind of learning, any modality, any religion, any of these different parts, the truth is within. The truth is within us. And I think that's the bit that scares us, because the power that we then hold is immense. But that then means that we have the opportunity to do the work to find it. And that's the bit that, again, can be very scary, because that's not something that we've been encouraged or supported to do. And we don't have the communities that we used to have to sit with others and witness each other and just say, well, how are you feeling? What are you sensing? How can I help you? How can I nourish you? How can I support you? And then it's this reciprocity that then forms. The danger is we become into this kind of approach of thinking, I have to support you. I have to grow this thing in a way that benefits me or you. And there's this kind of bizarre duality that forms. And you're like, it's a mutual flourishing. That's kind of how I see this stuff working. And again, that's how I've managed to do my work.
A mutual flourishing. And that really just brings us on to your long table discussions. Is that how you call them? Tell us about that. I think it's absolutely beautiful.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, it's a sort of idea that I've learned about, seen about. And I think other people, kind of have this sort of concept of it as well. But it's probably about 20 years ago, I would say, I read this thing that said about the longer table as a concept. And, if you have more than you need, you build a longer table or a higher wall. That had more prominence to it because of certain leaders, in America and things, of thinking we start to protect what we have. And that just didn't sit right with me. So that started to have it planted this idea in me of how do we begin to bring people together to just share, communicate, to explore and navigate things. I then was very fortunate in that I've become part of this, regenerative farm that I'm now part of, and one of the creators of the farm and the kind of amazing inspirational person. She had separately had these ideas as well. So I think neither one of us had quite worked it out, but we do work together on other projects. And then we just said, oh, this really cool idea about this longer table thing. And he said, oh, I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about that. So then again, this idea of just mutually stuff, arriving at the right time. And what we started to do was just started to think, well, we've got incredible setting. We've got a farm where the food is grown, fully organic, no dig, incredible regenerative sort of growing. We have this idea of there's a loss of belonging within people, within society. How do we bring together people with an amazing question, but also with the food and the curiosity to do that? So I just help facilitate the conversation. It always has a loose theme. The first one was around the idea of the strangeness. So this idea of, we need to witness and call out, what are we feeling, again, without any right or wrong. So it has a sort of theme of just saying at some point, Terence McKenna, I think, had his sort of view on this around at some stage, we're going to start to have this, we have to call out the weirdness. We have to say, what's going on? And if we don't, we all feel like we're the weird ones. And that becomes the whole Emperor's New Clothes type thing. So everyone's sort of whispering in the corners, and yet the algorithm's telling us that we're in our own little bubble, so it's not true. The second one was called Enough. So it was the idea of what is enough? So how do we begin to sense that we have enough? Because if we can't even answer that, how do we ever build our life in a way that feels like it's going to reach that point? And then we started to then look at how we just sort of bring different price points to it so that we open the table as long as possible. Stunningly beautiful location. And it seems to really be landing well with people. And they seem to really be enjoying coming together without an agenda, and friendships are forming.
So, if any of our viewers and listeners are kind of resonating with that specific idea, which is a very simple idea in principle, what's the first step that they could take to maybe doing the same thing in their community?
go to where the food is growing in a regenerative way. Find the market gardens, find the communities that are asking the questions. Because I think for me, the food provenance is so important because then you meet the people that understand the soil, they understand the biodiversity, they understand the healing that needs to be done. Again, this idea of the reciprocity between us and the land and us. I would say go there because that means that you've then got the experience and I suppose awareness and learning of people that literally live in rhythm with land. And that's why I love so much what I've been building with Kate at the farm is that I don't have the experience of living in that way. I don't have the way that, understanding in those ways of doing that stuff. Kate, is friends and trained with Charles Dowding, who's obviously one of the pioneers of the no dig communities. And that, again, is something that I learn from every time I visit the farm, every time I work with Kate, because she's got that experience. It then means that if I then, have an idea around something, I can then sit and co-create something with the people that really understand it. I'm not here to say I understand how soil works. Really, I have an understanding of it. I have a learning of it. I haven't lived it, and I think that's the bit of if we're looking to create any kind of offering, gathering, community thing, go to the people that have actually got some experience of it, because quite often we project our own need onto something else, and before long, you could build something and then think, well, either it doesn't resonate or it's not what I hoped for, or even worse, you've done a bit of damage because the people that could have really done something incredible and you could have benefited from your support and knowledge have not had that. So that's the bit I'd always say is co-creation is a huge part of what I do because I love it. I love learning and growing with others. And also I only have my experience, I have my lens to see things.
The system that we've got now that we all live in is, I feel, is the antithesis of that. It is deeply divided. It's built to be deeply divided. How would somebody watching this that feels a similar way, that's like, okay, I get the whole inner work stuff, and I'm not being facetious when I say it like this,
Sure,
Nick. We get the inner work stuff, but what do we do? Look, we look in our lives and we see this backdrop. What do we do? Do we address that, or is it just about this inner work? What do you think?
it's a really, it's an amazing question. I think it's one that I sit with very often, and I'll give you my current sense of that. I might disagree with myself in a few minutes, so I'll start talking and see where we get to. But I think for me, because I really accept that. I really do feel that because, I'm part of amazing communities. I listen to amazing, people, it's so amazing. And there's been points, again, back to this idea of parts. It's like, which part is operating in me at that time? Sometimes I can hear these things that can feel quite ethereal or quite sort of, out there. And sometimes probably the anger that you say that I'd had from the pain that I felt, the hardships that I felt. My life has not been easy. You could say I've had it hard. Other people have it harder. Like, you get caught up in these sort of dynamics of, how do we all feel and experience things? But for me, there's some bits of myself. I am angry about certain things. If someone then presents this option of, it's just like this or follow this way and you'll feel all right. I've done most of those things. I've experienced most of those things. I've done all the modalities of things. And sometimes I'm left with this feeling of, well, that's fine, but what about the fact I've got to pay my mortgage tomorrow? What about the fact I've got to do these things? And that's the rub. That's this part of this that I think that we need to acknowledge, and also privilege that then falls into this of thinking sometimes the people that even have the space to do these deeper inner navigations, it's because they've got the opportunity to do those things. Many people don't have that luxury because of the division in the system, because people are just simply trying to eat, provide shelter for themselves. And it's, if I sense the pain, I feel the pain, that really hurts me and upsets me. There's just this slight sense of me of, if we look outward and if we look at that, our nervous system will not be able to cope. I work a lot and sort of in different ways now with the sustainability movement, in inverted commas. A lot of that is based around shame, dogma, not allowing us the freedom to really, sense stuff that is the sort of elephants in the room that we can't call out. So there's this kind of sense of, if I just look outward, I might end up with a triggered nervous system that's starting to get caught up in the drama triangle of, I'm now going to sort of be this, victim, or I might start trying to rescue people, or I might try and do all this stuff. For me, the answer that I found personally, again, this is just my own experience, all the while I was looking outward, I was getting angry, I was getting unable to function, my wise brain was not operating, the practicalities of life became so noisy that I wasn't ever going to be able to heal. So I could have stayed in that, if I've thought about it in that practical sense, I could have stayed in jobs that I didn't. I could have, got more money. I could have, done these different things to be in parts of communities that are creating more data to prove us that we are seeing these problems happen. But all of that led me back to this point of powerlessness again. the only thing I can really change, get busy in my own little corner, which is something my mum used to say, is like, my own part is my circle. Think about the circles, and it's a Joanna Macy theory of kind of what's the circle that I feel. If I'm not okay in myself, if I don't have the roots for myself, I can't possibly be of service to myself or the people around me. So that's where I kind of say that. So there is a real tension. I completely, I really do feel that of, I don't want to be kind of the person just sitting here saying, just do all the inner work and everything will be fine, because that's not been my experience. So, but all I'm saying is, if we do the work on the roots, if we were going to try and plant a new thing, I would always be looking at the soil. That's where I would begin. That's where I think anyone would begin. I'd look at what soil am I growing it in? How do I nourish the soil? What quality of seeds am I using? And then I would create the climate outwardly. So outside of that, I'd then look at what conditions are out there to ensure that if there is a headwind, I know I've got the right roots in place. Or if there is a toxic input, then I know that I've got the right roots again to do that. Otherwise, we're into this world of, if we just look outwardly, no tree grows from the canopy down. That's where I think sometimes we can get ourselves caught, because, and there is also, again, it is a reciprocity. It's like you need the stuff outwardly, you need the support, you need the systems to change, you need the people that are doing other types of work to go back into this compost that's keeping us going.
When we link that into the quantum realm, everything originates through the quantum realm into the material world that we then experience as the story, which is exactly what you're saying. I tend to use this word substrate for that quantum realm that gives us the raw material that we are actually made of and present with. So really what you were just saying there, you're using the word soil because you're relating it to nature, to growing food and to being regenerated in that sense. And the way that I would look at it was that the substrate is there and that we're a part of it. And I think that what you've just described really eloquently, we talk about in shamanism, don't we? We talk about being having one foot in both worlds, the spiritual and the material.
Yeah.
And really what you described is exactly that, is that we walk with one foot in the material world and the day-to-day necessities, and the other world absolutely in the inner world, and seeing how the two match and respond and vibrate, resonate, to give us the story that we are actually embodying in that moment. And I think you've described that absolutely beautifully. The work that you do obviously is very built around cycles of nature and cycles of growth and development and all of that, the process of, it's almost spiral in nature. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what do you think the cycles of nature have in store for us to learn from? How can we learn from that aspect in life?
I think it's a really interesting point, because there's, this is part of the work that I do with individuals as well, is starting to look at what season are we in, because obviously there's so many different seasons that we're part of. And I think spiral is a really interesting concept, because, often we talk about going around in circles, like when I actually shift your perspective, you're going in a spiral that's growing. It's that kind of thing of, if we go from the horizontal, sort of the vertical into the horizontal, we can start to see actually it's all part of this journey. I think there's seasons and cycles within a kind of shorter period, but there's also seasons and cycles in a longer period. So obviously when we consider the seasons, that gives us the opportunity to think about where are we within our own part, and that's what we do. So I've created these events with Kate around the Wheel of the Year. So we bring people onto the land to start to notice what would be a normal cycle for us in terms of a natural setting. So we go through literally 8 times of the year. We bring a group of people together to look at it through different lenses, whether it be through a personal lens, a business lens, and start to say, well, what would harvest mean to you as a theme? Or what does it mean when we get to the summer solstice? What does that then mean to us? And I think that bit that is so powerful for me is that liminal kind of space that I think, kind of you mentioned, is this thing of, where are the bits where the sort of the cracks are starting to open? Where are the bits that we're starting to sense? And obviously within seasons, that is something that's talked about a lot in those cross-axes equinoxes. Then you start to think about a longer term view of what season are we in terms of climatically, where are we? So there's obviously a huge lens we could apply to look at that, to say what's changing, what's shifting, what do we need to be aware of? And I think a huge part of my own part, which sort of moves us again into that slightly different territory of the physics, the metaphysics, the different kind of, like the sort of substrates, or kind of how we look at that, is a big part of that as well, has been the sort of physics of things like Taoism, or, Buckminster Fuller. I think you can see some of my things behind me. I'm a huge, he's been a huge part of my own journey. The breadth of learning and the wisdom that he had to view things so differently in a way that I've never witnessed anyone talk about the way things that he was talking about. The ability for him to look at length of time in a completely different concept, and the way that he could jump between what we would consider, again, some people might consider as spiritual, but he saw it as this is just the principles of life. This is just the way that these things happen. And he was, in his own way, deeply connected to things like animism. He wouldn't have named it as that, but that is what he did. He was also deeply connected to physics and inventions and engineering and those things. And I think that's the bit for me is where are the things that we can notice a pattern backwards, so that sense of what can we learn from here, but do it with absolute curiosity. One of Bucky's ideas was dare to be naive, dare to go with the truth. Like, this is the bit, and obviously my business is called Daring Works. It's like, and these sort of the platonic solids as well. When you start to learn, Bucky was has got a carbon molecule named after him and stuff. These are the things, they're the building blocks of everything: nature, ourselves, businesses, everything. Like, there is nothing else. So I think that bit for me is, when we look at seasons, we look at time, it's going in a way that when we look forwards, we're then also able to say, just because it's been like that, it doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. Just because it's been like that, it doesn't mean it's going to stay like that. And I think that's what I get from like learning from and spending my time with some of the people that have been deeply involved in Bucky's work. I go on a book club with them, and I learn from these amazing elders of that community. It's just, you start to feel that there's the different story that's there, but exactly to your point around spirals, it's seeing what's growing, what's elevating, and what's going up and down in a different way. That through my shamanic sort of learnings, I start to understand in a different way, because we start to see that the different realms that are there, rather than it being this kind of concept of linear kind of ways, it's more like, well, what's going on in the kind of sort of lower parts, what's going up in sort of the higher parts, that in a different sort of way. But it's not a hierarchy, and that's the bit I think that so much of my work up to that point had been like this idea of looking through a lens of how do we sort of prove something, whereas actually when you zoom back out and say, well, we're all part of one interconnected system, as Bucky would say, we're on one spaceship Earth. Like, there's this kind of idea of our connection is mutual. It is in that way. So therefore, sharing what seasons we might be in individually, also what seasons might we be in collectively as well.
In your experience of working with different business leaders, shall we say,
Sure.
do you see a shift within their thinking that actually is opening up more to the holistic nature and the interconnectedness of everything?
I'd say some are, for sure. It's the same as anything in life. And some people are, just as they are, leaders of people as well, in that sort of sense of just seeing what they're sensing. The bit that I'm curious about is the language still seems to be slightly intimidating to people. If we kind of, what I'm finding interesting is we seem to have a collective awakening of doing things that would have not been that long ago been considered a bit woo-woo. Things, I live on the south coast of the UK, so I have, we have loads of cold dipping people. We have saunas. We have people that are doing yoga a lot. There's people that are doing sound baths. There's people that are doing all the things that, I would say are things that you just do anyway. They're just the right things to do. There's people, learning in Qigong, Reiki, like all the amazing stuff. But then, and they come as individuals, they come as a human being, and they quite happily sit in those spaces. They quite happily have that experience. They love it, and they can feel the sense of nourishing them. They then go back into the corporate world on a Monday morning, and quite often they'll then hide that part. And that's the bit that I find really curious is, why do we allow ourselves the space to do it as an individual? But because of the collective culture of not just the business, it's actually a broader sense of, I have to look professional, I have to look polished. If you said to someone, what do you do at the weekend? Oh, I had went to an amazing gong bath, and I really had this incredible experience. I went on a real cool trip, on this amazing journey. Even psychedelic use is now becoming more and more prevalent in many different ways and things. And people do it. They go off on these posh retreats and stuff. They might just about name that because it's becoming a little bit more accepted. But in reality, there's still this sense of, I don't want to be considered as weird, which is not weird. It's just that there's this sense of, when I'm at work, I'm a CEO, I'm a director, I'm this, I'm that. Some businesses, I would say more progressive ones, are definitely getting the sense of, really be yourself, really accept that. But there's still, there's a swim lane. There's still this kind of thing of, you can go to that point. It's like, talk about yoga. That's probably all right. Talk about the fact that I'm pushing myself into these deep existential shamanic journeys where, I kind of become, part of a different sort of community for a while. That's going to be a bit odd for the people that aren't on that path, and they don't want you to tell that part of the story. So that's the bit that I'm always sitting the tension with. And I'm not telling anyone it's right or wrong, you should be doing this or that. It's just, if it feels important to you in your own life, it logically to me would feel like you'd want to also be authentic in your other life. But it goes back to the Gabor Mate work of attachment and authenticity. It's like we trade our own authenticity to attach to something. So the question therefore has to come, do I want to attach to that society or that business or that community anymore? And that's a question for your own authenticity to answer. My only call out for that, and it's where I probably got to, is if you ignore those intuitive senses, they will catch up with you. That's just my experience of your body is saying, I enjoy going to a sauna every time, or I enjoy doing a gong bath, whatever. If you then ignore that, that part of you is going to at some stage start speaking to you in a way that you might not even recognize, saying, well, why aren't you saying that then? And this idea of parts work again, of if we ignore and don't give a voice to the bits that are really powerful, those bits will become more, problematic in some ways, and maybe actually get to the point where they'll shut you down because they'll be like, your brain is saying, I don't want to tell that story because I will look weird, because that's how I perceive that to be for those people. But internally, I'm thinking I have to live that, otherwise it's going to end up in a bad way. So that's kind of my thing. Is I would say it is shifting, definitely, but there's also a sense of people have to also accept that there might be a trade-off at some points, depending on how authentic they want to be, and that's a question for individuals.
I guess that's the eternal battle that we all face as human beings while we're in this form, is simply accepting who we are. But first of all, to do that, we have to find ourselves. So, Nick, mate, it's been absolutely brilliant. I do hope that sometime, not too distant future, you'll be able to come back again, because I think we could probably talk about the power of the individual to change the collective, which I think would be very interesting to discuss with you as a possibility, and a hope that that is what is possible. So where do people find you if they want to get involved in your work and dig you out and maybe take up some of the coaching? Where do they find you?
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'd say the first place is my website. So it's daring.works. I do a weekly newsletter. So again, it's just some of my more thinking, and it's helped me to probably find my words in a sort of different way. So that is really cool. And then just, LinkedIn, Nick Whitnell, Instagram, nick.whitnell. Just, come and say hi, and love to hear how this all lands with everybody.
Yeah, so will I. I really look forward to it. I have loved having you on. Thank you so much for your time. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.